Ever wanted to be a pirate sailing the seas for thrill and for treasure? How about being an explorer, charting out and naming unknown islands in an archipelago? Or maybe what you want is to follow a giant living statue of stone filled with the souls of hundreds of thousands of dead people. If you're into all that, then maybe Pillars of Eternity 2 is the game for you. Developed by Obsidian Entertainment, this game continues off from its prequel. Coming from the Hollowborn crisis of the Deerwood, you now find yourself braving the waters of the Deadfire archipelago, home to the Juana and other large factions, in search for treasure, land, and most importantly, a long-lost city. It's not all smooth sailing, of course, as these games tend to be. Power struggles will pull you in all directions, as well as your own interests and thirst for power. Companions will agree or disagree with your decisions, and there's always a bit of divine intervention lurking here and there as your quest progresses. The same can be said game-wise, as there are a few hurdles that I came across while playing the game, some larger than others. We'll be talking about all that and more in today's video. We're here to discuss about the base game of Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire and figure out, is it worth playing in 2025? I'll be talking about the game's story, gameplay, and replay value, then at the end, we'll have a conclusion to wrap it all up. There's a lot to talk about in this game, so make sure you're all comfy and possibly have a snack in hand while watching. Let's get started. The story actually starts off from the ending of the first game. If you still have the saved file from Pillars of Eternity 1, the game gives you the option of importing it and using the decisions you've made back then to influence the world of the second game. I did play the first game, however that was so long ago that I already deleted the save file. Luckily, Pillars of Eternity 2 has its own custom-made world settings that you can use. You are a Watcher, a human who is able to see and interact with souls of both the living and the dead. More specifically, you're the Watcher of Caed Nua, the protagonist of the previous game who dealt with the Hollowborn crisis. This tells you that you already have a name in this world. You'll be using that recognition to good use later on when you meet prominent figures in the world of Deadfire. After a not-so-brief recall of the events of the first game, one of your companions speaks about how the spirits in Caed Nua, your fortress, weren't really at rest. Soon enough, you find this to be true. A massive Adra stone shaped as a hand springs to life and crushes the building built within its grasp. A whole giant Adra statue was springing to life underneath your fortress, sowing havoc and destruction. Souls of people nearby were sucked into the statue, bodies left lifeless on the ground, including yours. Your soul, now separated from its host, now wanders in the in-between, a sort of purgatory where souls linger before going through the process of rebirth. At the end of the path, your soul is sucked into a bright Adra stone. You come out the other side, where a dwarf greets you through gestures and no words. Opening the door before you, the floating debris form a pathway to a figure sitting across a round table. This figure is the Pallid Knight, a manifestation of Berath, the god of cycles and of life and death itself. After a conversation, you're led to the character creation screen, but before that, you might have already noticed a flaw with how the story is being told in the game. The game is telling way too much of the story and not showing it. If you're into lore dumping through long strings of text, then this won't bother you. After all, the voice acting is great. If you're a bit impatient though, then you'll find yourself skipping through a bunch of text. This observation carries on until the very end. You'll be reading a lot in this game. Moving into character creation, you'll notice that choices are quite limited. Not too much of an issue for me since I'm not really known to be that picky when it comes to making my character. Gameplay wise, there's more variety here, and you see this when you start picking your class and subclass. We'll get into that more later though. After character creation, the Pallid Knight basically tells you to follow that huge statue as her herald. Oh, and that statue? Yeah, it's actually another god that's been reborn, Eothas. With that, your soul is guided back to its body. It lies on a ship, conveniently already following the statue to the archipelago of Deadfire. The game gives you a solid purpose. Although it's given through lazy means, it's enough to get you going. Right from the get-go, you're tasked with confronting a god. But why the Deadfire? What is Eothas there for, and what's gotten the other gods so riled up about his actions? Those are only a small number of questions that get answered as you play the game. Of course, chasing the Titan isn't your only concern. Word has spread of Aothas, and people know about you and your title. The factions residing here will pull you in different directions. Do you swear allegiance to one, sabotage others, or do you just choose to be indifferent to the archipelago's problems and focus on your main task? Your choices here will affect the outcome of the region. Choose your allies carefully. As an RPG, it goes without saying that stats and backgrounds influence if what you say is convincing enough to the other party. I played as a barbarian, so there were a lot of times where intimidating my way through someone's good graces was a viable option. Your background may also provide additional choices, but I never experimented with classes and backgrounds enough to find out if they had significant differences. You can build reputation with factions in the game that get you in their good graces, which help you out depending on their specialty. This, of course, gets you on the bad side of other factions, but choices have consequences here, which is painfully evident with most decisions related to quest lines. There's a lot of deviation that goes on here, but then this brings me to one of the game's biggest blunders. The game's ending is easily its weakest link. There's a ton of deviation that happens in between the story's progression, but in the end, there's not much you can do to influence the ending. The main ending is the same, with your final dialogue choice with Aothas creating one of the larger deviations, but ultimately, it was all a letdown. I was exploring everywhere, doing every side quest, grabbing any piece of unique gear, and leveling up to max stats so I could prepare myself with my confrontation with this giant titan of a god, but in the end, it was all for nothing. I thought it would be the climax of the story, but in truth, it already peaked a few moments ago before the big moment. The story ends with a slideshow ending, showing what happens to Deadfire given the choices you've made. It's a nice setup for a next game, but I was left with disappointment as I watched the slideshow and the credits roll. Now that's enough about the story. Let's talk about how you're actually going to be playing the game. Pillars of Eternity 2 is a top-down RPG. You can have the camera follow your character, but for the most part, you'll want it to be free and you move it using the WASD or directional keys. Unfortunately though, you can't rotate the camera around, so if you were looking for a way to get a good look around those buildings, that just isn't possible in this game. Besides NPCs, there are objects in the world you can interact with, most lead to loot though. You won't be picking up crates and throwing them onto enemies in this game. You can keep these highlighted by toggling it using left alt, or check from time to time by pressing tab. Take note that not all interactable items are highlighted with this feature, so you'll still need to keep a keen eye for a few secrets. Pillars of Eternity 2 was made with real-time with pause combat in mind. I'm not sure when turn-based combat for this game came out, but I chose that option instead since I was more used to it coming from Baldur's Gate 3. I thought I'd get a similar experience with Solasta or Baldur's Gate 3 now that it was turn-based, but nope. It was way different than expected. While things are turn-based, the turn order can change from round to round. It depends on the actions you make during your turn. Let's say you move and you make an attack action during your turn. In the next round, you'll end up around the same place in the turn order, keeping all things the same. Comparing that to if you just moved, then ended your turn, you'll come up much quicker in the turn order for the next round. This is the same for everyone in combat, so it can get confusing, especially with larger combat encounters. Casting spells take time, so if you target an area with a fireball, if you don't time it correctly, those enemies still have time to move out of the spell. This is all fairly explained well in the game, but it's definitely a point worth noting if you're going to play this on turn-based mode. Another thing to consider with this mode is the time for each combat encounter. Due to the nature of the turns being dynamic, some encounters that should last mere seconds in real time with pause can last up to a few minutes in turn-based mode. If I had a choice to play the game over again, I'd go with real time with pause and not turn-based just for the time-saving aspect. Now that we're done talking about that though, let's get into more specifics with combat. Each character has movement, an action, and free actions that they can do on their turns. Based on your class, you'll also have resources to spend to use your skills. As a barbarian, I had rage points to cast my abilities. A fighter will have discipline, a priest has spell slots, and so on. An interesting mechanic to this is that these resources replenish after each combat encounter. No need to save your spells for bigger fights, just go ahead and use them. So you've gotten a few battles under your belt and gained experience. Time to level up. When leveling up, you're given points to spend on attributes and abilities. Attributes help you out with doing actions in the world like climbing walls, picking locks, and sneaking. Abilities are either active or passive skills that come in handy during combat. You can also choose to multi-class when leveling up, but I didn't do that in my run. At certain points, you gain a power level when leveling up, which not only unlocks the next tier of abilities, but also permanently increases the potency of lower power level spells. This keeps all your abilities relevant up until the very end of the game. Now that you know how to fight and get stronger, let's start exploring the map. There are two types of maps in this game, a kind of local map and the world map. Exploring the local map is like moving between areas in a city. This takes time, which is something I'll get into more later on, and you can encounter random and not so random events while traveling from one place to another. What's more important though is the world map. You explore the world map like you would an old school JRPG. You don't encounter enemies randomly while exploring, but there are a ton of places to explore, both on foot and sailing the sea. This is, after all, a pirate-themed RPG. Early in the game, you gain access to your first ship, the Defiant. Your ship has its own crew, its own equipment, health, stats, etc. This is where a tiny mechanic comes into play, ship management. Your crew needs to be paid, fed, and their spirits kept in a good mood. I was the best ship captain anyone could ask for, so I never found out what could happen if you went wrong with any of these, but I assume your crew would bail on you or even outright try to throw you out of your own ship. The bulk of your adventure will be spent sailing the open sea, so it's best to know that the worst thing to look out for isn't sea monsters or deadly storms. It's other people. Most ships will make a beeline for you to try and sink you and raid you for plunder. You can choose to outrun them, if you can, or fight. You can fight in this scenario in two ways, naval or shipboarding combat. Naval is basically you and your crew trying to sink the enemy's ship using your cannons. This gets pretty boring, to be honest, after a few hours of trying it out, but it's the best way to get your crew some experience. Shipboarding combat is just normal combat, but on top of the ships. With the promise of loot out in the Deadfire, there's no shortage of pirates who'll try to steal from you. I wouldn't blame them. Some of these islands hold some really powerful artifacts. Loot also provides a noticeable push in your combat prowess, especially the unique tier of items. Unique items are items that have special effects and can be enchanted to be brought to a higher gear tier and to unlock more effects. Some of these can warrant a change in playstyle, so make sure to find as many of these as you can. Similar to other RPGs though, some of the best loot can be found as rewards from defeating bosses. Bosses in this game aren't grand. There are probably a handful of bosses that the game throws at you that can give a memorable fight. That being said, I still felt the thrill of testing out my team's capabilities when met with an unexpected boss fight, though I'd have probably enjoyed it more if I didn't play in turn-based mode. Last thing to note about bosses is that there are a few called mega bosses. I'm not sure how many there are in the base game, but I think I was only able to find one. Do not take these on if you choose to play on turn-based mode. You'll be at them for hours. Somebody out there has probably done these mega bosses on turn-based mode, but from personal experience, just don't. To cap out the gameplay section, I'd like to mention a few things I think should be noted if you decide to pick this game up. I mentioned this game has a lot of reading. Well, this game also has a lot of walking. You'll be finding yourself either walking through the local and world map or in areas getting from one place to another. It gets tedious after a while, which is alleviated a little bit by the fast mode feature, which speeds up the game time. Unfortunately, fast mode doesn't affect how fast the loading screens pass, so make sure to install this game on an SSD to make sure you have the best load times possible. As for game time, you'll want to keep track of this as well. There are instances in the game where it's hinted that if you don't get somewhere within an allotted time, the outcome or the encounter changes. I wasn't able to experiment on this since I went through the game only once, but I still think about what could have changed if I got to some of the places earlier or even later. As for bugs and crashes, the only memorable bug I had was that sometimes my trap guy could see that there was a trap on the floor, but clicking on it to disarm it did nothing. It's a known issue that never got fixed, and I doubt that it's the only one given the game's age. The game only crashed once for me, and this was during a prolonged gaming session where I was alt-tabbing a lot. It was a fairly smooth experience from start to end. And that's about it for the gameplay section. We'll move on to the final part of the video, replay value. It took me around 82 hours to complete my first run. If I wasn't on turn-based mode, I probably would have cut it down to like 60 or 70 hours. There's no NG Plus in this game, and once you finish the game, there's no way to go back to your saved file unless you load a previous saved file. There's a lot of deviation that you can create when playing the game, from the classes to the background to the choices you make, but knowing that the ending stays mainly the same, I don't think I'll be going through another run of this game. You could also try to experiment with timing in the game, like going to key moments in the story earlier or later in in-game time to see if any of the encounters change, but I personally don't think it warrants a whole new playthrough. To me, Pillars of Eternity 2 is more of a one-and-done RPG that loses its magic after you witness the ending. Nothing hooked me back into making a new character and exploring the world again. So, is the game worth playing in 2025? I think it's still worth a go, but it's not exactly a must-play. You could skip this game and I think you wouldn't be missing out on much. I don't remember the first game a lot, but I know I enjoyed the ending of that game much more than this one. Now, if they're planning to make a third game, that creates a whole other point for playing this game, but until then, my verdict for this game will stay the same. Thanks for reaching all the way to the end of the video. Hope you guys had a great time celebrating the holidays and are ready for another year of game reviews from yours truly. Let me know how you liked the video, and if you have anything to say about the game, feel free to share it with us in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay safe out there and have a great day ahead.